Okay. Last week, I got about halfway through President McElwain. And from President McElwain's point of view, that was the good part. He had actually ramrodded constructing the first academic building Hampden-Sydney had ever had, 70 years after the last building had been constructed. And he's very proud of that. Well, he might have been, except what sort of doesn't make the newspaper is that he didn't raise the money for it. He was president of college, he was supposed to be raising the money. And he was smart and committed, but he wasn't very good at raising money. And so they got about half the money raised for it. And he said, okay, he and the board said, okay, let's go ahead and start this. And I'll keep on raising money while we're building the, it's going to take a year or so. Well, they got it built, and he had raised virtually no more money. And at this point, you're trying to raise money. Let me think. You're trying to raise money for a building that's already there and functioning. And nobody wants to give you money for something that's already done. So they went about 10 years. It went almost till 1900 with the board getting budget reports on the fundraising for Memorial Hall. And it was always the same amount that they had, and they had paid the bills. I mean, it's not like they couldn't pay the bills, but they had done it by borrowing against the endowment. And so after about 8 or 10 years of this, and being told that no money was coming in every time the board met, they voted to take that off the agenda and simply to charge it forever against the endowment. So that's how the bills got paid. But still, hey, that was nice, but there was trouble coming up. One of the things that the Civil War had done most aggressively was to start the process of urbanization in America. Before the Civil War, well over 90% of all the U.S. inhabitants lived on a farm. Now, about 1.5% live on a farm, okay? And they all went to town. And that started when the armaments manufacturer, uniform manufacturer, and every other kind of manufacturer that goes with having a war on, went on in all the northern cities, and for that matter, most of the southern cities. And urbanization has the effect that all the civic activity is going on in the cities. And seminaries had been established by groups who wanted to have a peaceful, pastoral, quiet place to think about eternal issues and not have distractions. And in fact, if you remember, as you were here for the early part, Princeton moved to 3 different locations, always trying to get further away from the sins of New York City. And this was when New York City didn't even have a nightclub. But anyway, the feeling was that being out in the country would enable people to focus on these permanent issues. And as time went on from 1865 to 1895, people in the church began to be more and more concerned that, yeah, there's still a lot of people out in the country. They pretty much all go to church. There's a whole bunch of people in the city who aren't going to church. And at least one of the reasons for this is there aren't any churches around. We need to build churches, but we need to staff them. And we need to have people in there. And there's any Christian example in the face of the hurly-burly of the modern economy. And this was called the social gospel. And it was very popular in the Presbyterian church in particular. But its popularity was mostly limited to the younger generation in the church. If you went to seminary after the Civil War was over, you probably supported this and wanted to move the seminary from Hampden-Sydney to Richmond, where they could actually do things in the middle of the city, and the city could see what a Christian approach to living in the city was like. The older generation went to seminary before 1860, tended still to feel that the white surroundings were the answer to this, and there is no compromise. You're either going to do one of these things or you're going to do the other one. I mean, moving halfway to Richmond is not a solution. But there were enough young, aggressive farmhalls on seminary faculties around the country, but in particular ours, that it stayed a live issue, and it seemed to be gaining ground as time went by. And the seminary board, which was the older generation, was particularly concerned about one young fireball that they had who kept getting invited to synod meetings all around the country to present the message for the social gospel. And he was good at it. And to nail him down, they built him a house on the campus. The Maples is the house they built for him. And it was a big, nice brick house. Okay. Nicer as a house then than it is as an academic building now. And he said, thank you, moved in. And within 18 months, he had gotten the vote adjusted and the seminary agreed to move. And so giving him a free house didn't do any good at all. Eventually, it did us some good, but the beginning about 1890, 1891, Memorial Hall was finished and they started using it. And this just about coincided with the beginnings of the high voltage movement to move the seminary, which in one sense had nothing to do with Hampden-Sydney College. Separate board of trustees, separate management, everything. But Dr. McElwain was a loyal alumnus of both institutions, and he felt strongly that it should stay here. And he spent most of his time through the 1890s, until 1895, politicking to try to be sure that when they had a synod meeting, it didn't vote to move the seminary, because you only have to have one vote to move it, and it's all over. And in 1895, having won several close elections at synod meetings in the early 1890s, we get to 1895 and they have a synod meeting, and this is on the agenda for the afternoon topic of discussion, okay? And it was discussed in the afternoon, also after supper, and all evening, and after midnight. They finally had a vote in which moving the seminary to Richmond passed by one vote in the synod meeting, and that was the end of it. Now, one of the reasons it passed was that Major Gitter, who had made a ton of money in the tobacco business and was busy endowing parks and things like that around Richmond, offered to give them a city block in Northwest Richmond free to build a new campus on. And he was also going to get $50,000, and nobody else, there were other sites proposed, but nobody else was willing to give building money. So what they agreed to was his package. And it was going to take a couple of years for it to pay off. But you can imagine that Dr. McElwain was just devastated by this news. Didn't really have anything to do with Hampden-Sydney, but still, it was everything he had worked to avoid. And through the next 2 years, 1896, 97, they worked away on building the buildings in Richmond. And in 1898, they moved and pulled out and left the seminary buildings here vacant. Yes, well, what exactly do you do with an educational institution that is all the way out in the country, not near anything, and you got the buildings all built, only who's going to want to buy it? Well, honestly, Hampden-Sydney College would be the one that wanted to buy it. So the seminary offered to sell it to Hampden-Sydney, the whole campus, for $10,000. And at the time, this would be approximately equivalent to offering to sell us the town of Farmville for $10 billion. Hampden-Sydney had seriously no money. And remember, the thing Dr. McElwain does not do very well is raise money. So got a real problem here. We'd like to have those buildings, but not only do we not have $10,000, I don't think we got 1,000 that's loose and not spoken for. Okay. Bring the first slide up. Here we are. This is about the fourth person in this history that you need to know about. This is Dickie Venable. He was in the class of 1857. He was very smart. I don't think he was valedictorian, but that's because he had an possibly evil sense of humor and kept getting in trouble. But he finished here with very high grades and went to UVA in a graduate math program, combination math and engineering program, which is the direction he wanted his career to move in. And he was most of the way through with that, and the war started. And he instantly volunteered for the Confederate Army, went in as a private, and came out as a major. This is a picture of late in the war as a major. And my feeling about looking at him is that I would not want to surrender to him for fear of basic extinction. But he was very proud of making it to major. And through his life, to people who he encountered casually, he wanted to be called Major Dick. And that went over well with people who bought into it, but most people, when he wasn't around, called him Dickie. And anyway, he, when the war was over, he had pretty good math and engineering background at this point, but he wanted to go into law. And so he went to Washington Lee, which had a law program. I don't think they had a law school, but they had a program that was intended to do the equivalent. And he said, I'll teach on your math faculty if you'll let me go to do a side effort here in your law program. And they said, oh, yeah. So he taught math at WNL for 2 years and went to your law program and got out with very high grades. He was smart. And basically, you have to decide where you're going to be a lawyer. And he was from, officially Charlotte County, but he was really from Prince Edward and Farmville. And that did not seem to him like where he wanted to be a lawyer. So somehow he picked out Baltimore as an earlier place to go to that needed lawyers. And I think, nobody ever says this, but I think the reason for it is that his interest in law was in real estate law. And real estate law is more interesting in Maryland than any place else on the East Coast. Because when the colony was founded, the king told the Quakers, told the Catholics who were going to Maryland that they couldn't sell any of the land. And so Maryland, until 1950, when I was living there and got caught by this, doesn't sell you land to build a house on. You get a 99-year lease on the land, Or if you want to commit yourself a little longer, you can get a 199-year lease on the land, but not any longer than that. But you will appreciate that this provides a fertile ground for people in the real estate law business. The lawsuits are going on all the time, and I think he knew that, and I think that's why he went to the ballroom. But he joined a partnership there, and in no time was one of the leading lawyers in Baltimore, which is saying a mouthful. And he was, in his spare time, in between lawsuits, he was teaching law courses at the University of Maryland. And he did that for 20 or 25 years. He had a long career teaching at Maryland. And his name became well known not only for real estate law, but also for constitutional law, because the old Confederate never could give up on this. And he was very interested in states' rights and what did the Constitution say states had the power to do and what was reserved to the federal government and so on. And he became one of the national leaders in states' rights constitutional law. And somewhere in the late 1870s, he dropped out of the partnership he was in and joined a new one, and but kept on teaching at Maryland. And in 1900, dropped out of the second one he had been in, and formed a new one with two of his best students from the University of Maryland law courses. So there's three of us, and he was opposite the head honcho, but he died in 1910, and so he was pretty close to retirement at that point. And it was understood that this was going to be a partnership where everybody was active and so on. And it turned into the biggest law firm in Maryland, and it is still there, and it's still the biggest law firm in Maryland. And for example, Kamala Harris's husband is a partner in that law firm now. So, he really did get into the law business. But you will appreciate that he made a lot of money doing this. And somewhere about late 1880s, 1890, he developed we just had homecoming, okay? He developed an alumnus longing to be able to come to Hampden-Sydney. So he came down here, and it turns out that by 1890, rail connections from Baltimore to Barnwell were actually quite good, way better than you'd think. In 1910, the United States had twice as many miles of railroad as it has now. Okay, railroads were the big thing, and you took the train to Pittsburgh and switched to one to Farmville, and you were here jiffy quick. And so he didn't commute, but he went back and forth from Baltimore to Hampden-Sydney about every 6 weeks from somewhere around 1890 until just before he died in 1910. And he was determined to use his money to improve Hampden-Sydney, a fine thing for people to decide. But he knew enough about the law and was smart enough to know smart ways to use money and how to use money to get what you want. And so he heard about the offer to sell that whole campus for $10,000, and he knew that college had no chance of affording that. So he wrote a letter, which the college has preserved, offering to buy it as long as his name was held out of this, and it was strictly Hampden-Sydney College who was buying it for the lowest possible price he could get it, and he would cover it. And when it was through, he would give the college most, but not all of the buildings, okay? And then you can have, I'll even help a little bit with it, but basically I'm going to buy the buildings for you. So, and by that time, I should say, the mustache was white, and he was about 50% bald, and he'd gained a good deal of weight, but he's a lot better looking in here. And he would have liked this picture better than the one of him when he bought the seminary. But he had, and I can't find a reliable date for this, somewhere in the early 1890s, had bought a big rambling frame Victorian house that stood across the street from your house in Brato. And it was about 6,000 square feet, and it had places you needed your UPS to get from Israel. And he bought that, and he had a cousin who was living in a Longwood house in Farwell, the one that the Longwood president's supposed to be living in, but isn't. Cousin was in that, and they had to leave. And so Dickie said, well, sure, come out and live in this. And in fact, you can live in it permanently. You and your 3 daughters, all of them were unmarried, and they're now old enough that if they were going to get married, it probably would have happened. So you and the 3 then can live there, and there's plenty of room. You just have to keep a nice place in there that I can get to and use. Okay. So he had family living in this house from the early 1890s, maybe even the late 1880s on. And he came down and looked at things, and he wanted to support sports. And I'm going to wait to do sports probably next week, but anyway, another talk. But he funded a lot of that. And this was the opportunity to buy the seminary had not come up yet, and he was fidgeting. So he was very happy to see the opportunity show up. And if you would go on to the next slide. Okay, I want to show you what he bought. This house is Penshurst. That's not what it was called when the seminary had it, but you know where that is. Next slide. This is probably what Penshurst looked like when it was built. That's a full-length porch all the way across the front of the building. And the college took that off and put up on a much more attractive central porch about 30 years ago. But anyway, but that's the same building. Next slide. Okay. Here we are with the seminary. And you recognize that. And that looks almost exactly the same now as it did when this picture was taken, which is 30 years ago. But the college had been very good about it, keeping it looking this way. Next slide. This is a lousy, but the only one we have, view of the Penshurst, that thing on the left. The seminary is in the middle, and middle court is the thing on the right. And these names are not what you were used to. Penshurst was called North Carolina House because the Senate of North Carolina apparently had paid for it. And if you know where to look, you can still see North Carolina House painted on the bricks on the chimney somewhere. But there's so many trees out there that you can't necessarily see the chimney that it's painted on. The seminary was, well, the seminary, and this house over on the right, which is Mill Court, was Boston House. And that seems to mean that they raised money for it in Boston, but no, that would have been the 1820s, and don't ask me. But they soon changed it. That house was an award for being the senior most respected faculty member on the seminary faculty. And so it was the first professor's house. If we were still doing that, psych would be living in it, but there you are. Next slide. Okay, here is what the building looked like when it didn't have a front porch, or rather did have a porch, but not a roof on it. Then at the end is, the far left end is Stagger Inn, which actually had a different architect from the rest of the building. But he designed a little piece of it that they could start building right away in 1822. Yeah, 1822. And stopped it at where the downspout is, the fire ladder. And for a reason not clear to me, another architect was hired to extend it to build the rest of the building. And so it looks sort of right, but not exactly quite right from there on. Next slide. Middle court. Okay. Keep going. Here's the seminary's library, Brown Library, which I assume is right across the street from the Brown Student Center, but I'm pretty sure it's different Browns that are involved. This is still there, except this part of the part of the building that they were using for a library is only a little bit longer than this room is wide. Okay, if you look at the building, the very front part of the building before you get back to the transepts has high domed windows and so on, and it looks like a small chapel, and that's what the seminary built to be a library. And it's still there, and we have built onto it and so on. Next slide. Okay, here's the inside the library in 1895, when there's no electricity anywhere on the Hampden-Sydney campus, and the photography is not all that handsome either, okay? And yet that's a really bright photograph. How did they do that? Well, almost the whole roof was skylights, okay? The number of shingles on that roof was very small, and it had a great effect. This was a nice place to go and read stuff, okay? Very good light. Except there's a problem, because if you have huge skylights in the roof, and you should have a fire start in the library, the first thing that happens is that these giant sheets of glass break in the flame, at which point you have a chimney the size of this room, okay, over top of the library. And that is why we do not have the first edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, which we used to have, or a first edition of Newton's Principia, which we used to have. They burned up in 1940. You know, there you are. We lit the building, it was not a hot fire, and the walls stayed intact. And so we cleaned up the ruins and left them there until after World War II, and finally built a cover over again and turned it into our library, which it had been all along since we got the building. But anyway, you know, sorry about the fire. Next slide. This is the fire in action, okay, and the flames are having a good time there. Next slide. Okay, this is please join the movement to keep the seminary here and stop going around making these speeches. House that they built in 1892, which got lived in for about 18 months before he got his, 2 years before he got his wish and moved to Richmond. Next slide. Okay, bet you didn't know about this one. I mean, you do know the house exists. It's down via soccer here. It's on the wrong side of the road for the seminary. Okay, and it was a seminary faculty house that somebody had built. Dr. Dabney had designed it in the Italianate fashion, and it's a really nice example of that. But when Dickie Crawley gave all of this to the college, he didn't give them that for a reason. And they were so happy to have everything else that I'm not sure anybody would have asked why they weren't getting that. But we'll come back to that. Next slide. Okay. The seminary prospered in terms of getting students through the 1870s and 1880s. And somewhere in the late 1880s, they ran out of dorm space. And so they were going to build a big brick dormitory, kind of like, like Venable is or something. And they tried to raise money in North Carolina and Virginia Synod's, and they got very little money turning in. So the brick building, the big brick building, turned into two smaller frame buildings. And this is, of course, the Chi Phi house, but it was built to be a dormitory for the seminary, and of course, it's right across the street, so very convenient. What is less obvious? Next slide. Sorry, this is an old picture, and that's the best I can do. This is its sister building, which sat right beside it, where the museum is now. Okay. It may have had the same floor plan, although this doesn't look quite right, but it's clearly sort of the same thing. And they put up two of these buildings, and one of them was the Geneva House, the other one was the Edinburgh House. Okay, that's it. And so this created, well, some inventive thinking on the part of some alumni. Hampden-Sydney, as a result of an agreement with the Presbyterian Church in somewhere around the 1840s, did not allow dancing on campus. Dancing meant rubbing against the female form, was clearly incredibly wicked. And so you couldn't dance anywhere on the campus. And if you think about that, there wasn't anything here but the campus. And Dickie Venable from the class of 1857 had been annoyed by this, just like everybody else. And he was willing to remember how annoyed he'd been. And so he did not give these two buildings to the college either. His idea, they were very close together. Okay, they're big houses, and those are not very big lots. They were very close together, and he was going to build a big connection between them and turn the whole thing into a hotel. And he came to the college and said, "What do you think, hotel?" And they said, "Nobody comes here." This is, and I may say that this is before we had intercollegiate athletics. But anyhow, the college talked him into the idea that he was never going to make any money if he spent money building a hotel. So he had these two buildings, and he could clearly rent them out. And there were fraternities. By 1890, there were already fraternities, and Chi Phi was scrambling to get to move into this one, which they managed in the 1920s. It was a while. But he had one, the second one he had nothing to do with. And some recent alumni, if this were happening now, it'd be the class of 2020, 21, and 2022 in Richmond, okay? They hadn't been able to dance either. And their man was fresher than Dickie Crawley's band. So they got together and said, "Let's talk to him about this." And they wrote him a letter and said, how about letting us have that other house that you're not using? And we'll raise the money and put a dance pavilion on the back of it. And because you own it and the college that's on, it is by definition not part of the college campus, and they can't enforce a dancing prohibition. And Dickie said, what a great idea. And it turned out that the recent alumni did not have to raise money. Dickie paid for putting the pavilion on the back of it, and then gave the building to the group, which had to form a legal body. And so it was the comedy, not ha-ha comedy, but close friendship, ties of friendship club. And the comedy club existed from about 1904 to 1940. And it took no time to put the pavilion up. And if you go to the next slide, this is a lousy newspaper quality picture taken at one of the dances in the 20s, but not with any flappers, with skirts above the knee. And this is the way dancing got done in Hampden-Sydney, in a building that was off campus, but by about 50 feet. So this was really great. And Hampden-Sydney dances became well known around Virginia. I mean, people would arrange to come over here for the dance and spend the night. And they got first class jazz bands and big bands to play for them. And in 1940, they had two brothers that each had a band. Anyway, they had a nationally well-known. Dorsey. Anyway, they had one on the books, and on the dance was going to be Saturday night in the spring, and sometime on Friday night, the frame building burned to the ground. Oops. And the then president, Dr. Gannon, used a telephone to call the alumni, and he called an emergency board meeting, and everybody showed up the next morning and decided that the ban on having dancing in college buildings probably didn't need to be enforced any longer, and you could use the new gym that was down there for the dance. And so they did, and that was the end of the comedy club. They tried to think about building another building, and everybody was perfectly willing to go down to the gym and do it there, and so that was the end of it. But this is the example of another feature of the college's culture that Dickie Venable had a big part in. Next slide. Okay, this should get you an idea where it was. That building used to be the post office. It was built to be the post office and has since then been extended twice to try to make it a decent museum space. Next slide.
Dr. Porterfield, question if I may.
Oh, yeah.
When the comedy club was in operation, pre-automobile, what was the transportation like to and from the gas? It seems like it'd be a town hard place.
Well, the through the 20s, most of the roads were still dirt roads, so you were probably going to take the train to Farmland and take a taxi or something to get out here, or have somebody come in and pick you up. But the Farmland Road got paved in the 1930s somewhere, and it would have been something you could drive to conveniently. What? Quasi conveniently. And but I think for the first 20 years, everybody who came to it that wasn't Hampden-Sydney came on that train, basically. anyways, this is the last place that the seminary built, and they put it up somewhere around 1840, and I can't get a date. And they were at the point they built it, they were intensely interested in maintaining a friendly, symbiotic relationship with Hampden-Sydney College. And so they built something that was a replica of the original college building that the college had just torn down. But notice that it had a full-length porch over the front, and what that was a dining hall for students. And that was the ground floor, and the kitchen over, I think the kitchen on the front and the students ate back, but I'm not sure about that. And of course, this does not have the extension that the president's office is in now. That's 1940, 1950. But basically, they rented out the second and third floor. And so it was a boarding house for some faculty members who could walk 2 stories down and eat, you know. But it was a dining hall for everybody else. And some of them had to stand out on the front porch in the rain till a chair opened up in the dining hall. And so if you go over and look, these windows on the front now have shutters on them, of course. But if you go over and look on both sides, at the brick on both sides of the mirror, you can find initials scraped into the brick that people were bored while they waited for supper had put up there long ago. And the initials are still there. Well, that's the complete set of buildings. And remember, what he paid for this whole set of things was $10,000. It's hard to realize what inflation has been like. But he still had Westford, that Italian house down here, that he wasn't living in and didn't particularly want to live in, but it was a nice house, and it had 16 acres of land with it because the lot runs all the way down to the creek and back. Now, I got a couple minutes here. Dr. McElwain was a Presbyterian preacher, and he was personally committed to charitable action by himself and by other people, but he was going to be an example. And so when he became president in 1883, it was not long before he decided, let me just remind you, in 1883, there are no buildings between the house part of Graham Hall and Theosopher, okay? This building obviously wasn't there, but neither was the one that was on this site before that. And Graham did not have the long gymnasium built on the back of it, okay? It was just a house part. So there is a really big backyard, okay, all the way to Theosopher and about as wide as Pauly is long, okay? And at his own expense, he hired a gardener, a guy who would come in and spend the summer plowing and weeding and planting and harvesting and things like that. And he turned the whole backyard into a produce vegetable garden, okay? And he gave it away. He was the food painter for Prince Edward County for a number of years. And everybody knew you could come out here, and it had to be something that grew in the ground but those are all the rules. Carrots are fine, corn is fine. We got all of it. And we got lots, and you can have a big certain. And this was a really good Christian thing to do. Unfortunately, if you're going to plant a garden with a footprint at least twice the size of the building, you're going to have to put up a fence around it because the deer will eat it off to the ground otherwise. And that's a big fence. And it needs to be like pretty tall because things will jump over a low fence. And that was going to cost a lot of money. So instead of buying new lumber and putting up a nice looking fence, he got whatever scrap lumber he could find and built a fence out of that, which was in at least 14 different colors, and the boards were different sizes and different lengths. And the fence looked just awful. And it's, let me think, not in the middle of the campus, because the middle of the campus then was where Cushing is. I mean, there was the Alamo at one end and the Cushing in the middle, and the Memorial Hall at the end of it, and then halfway down here was the president's house, and then there wasn't anything until you got to the seminary, and so this was very much a backyard. But Dickie Crawley had bought the house down past the Chi-Phi house, okay? And anytime he came to the campus, the bypass didn't exist then. Anytime he came to campus, he had to ride past this obscene fence, the huge obscene fence that was around the president's garden. So he came up with a clever idea. He offered, the reason he held Westfordton back was that he was going to make a trade with the college. How'd you like me to give you Westfordton, really nice house, the 16 acres of property, give it to you free in return for you making changes in building uses? And they said, what did you mean? He said, I want you to move the president out of Graham, out of the president's house. And give him one of these two other houses, because there's Penshurst Middle Court that I just gave you. You can give him one of those, and but move him out. And then I want you to turn the back of his backyard into a park. I want the fence taken down and trees planted and grass and all of that. And I may say that this happened at about the same time that an unknown alumnus donated a gasoline lawnmower to Hampden-Sydney, but nobody knows who that was, but you have your suspicions. So he said, you got to get rid of this visual garden. I understand it's good motives, but you got to get rid of it and turn it into a park type environment. And then I don't want you to put any president back in that building. I want the building turned into an academic building. So the Graham, what is now Graham, didn't have a name yet, but it became what I think was the first psychology department building in the country. Anyway, it was where you did psychology. And there were lots of other psychology departments, but I don't think they could have your own building. And so that was how he made sure that no president was ever going to move back in there. And the board bought up on that and called the president in and said, you're going to have to move to your choice of Penshurst or Middle Court. And he said, no, I like living in the president's house. And the discussion went on a little while, and someplace in there, somebody said, what part of no is did you don't understand? And he moved out, but he moved into Penshurst, but he was mad sops about it, and in about a year, he resigned. He retired and left campus. And it is all due to Dickie wanting a nice looking center with campus. But what this led to, and I got to quit here, what this led to was naming buildings. because what we had was, the Alamo, and everybody knew what that was for, and the college, and then we built Memorial Hall. And classes now are mostly Memorial Hall, and there's only a few left in the college. What is this whole part of the college or not? I mean, and so the students started calling the long building in the middle Cushing's building, okay, which was a great thing for them to do. And about the time this showed up, Dickie had bought the campus and donated to the college, and so the board's response to that was to say, we've never named buildings, but that big long one in the middle is going to be Velma Hall. Okay. That's the way that's going to be. And the students don't want to work this out, but we owe it to them anyway. That other one's going to be Cushing Hall. And but this time, President McElwain had slammed the door and left town. But they said, let's rename Memorial Hall McElwain Hall, because he was the one who spearheaded getting it built. And so they did. And from that point on, it has been traditional to name everything. But it really was past 1900 before we named buildings for people. But let me quit, and we'll come back and look at other really neat things that Dickie do with his money around campus next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
See you later.